All right. Sorry about that. There's a few different ways to skin a cat. So if PowerPoint won't work, we'll find another way to do it. So we do that. All right. So we are studying the Psalms, and we are studying a section called the cross, the crook, and the crown. And what that is from time to time you'll see little, what I like to call golden nuggets of the Bible, where the arrangement of something shows an emphasis. And what you see in these three Psalms that are grouped together is a focus on the Messiah. And so Psalm 22, which we've already looked at, it's a messianic psalm, and it is Jesus at his lowest point. In fact, in verse 6, he says, I am a worm. And we talked about that in the commentary, how that's the most insignificant animal or insignificant being that you can think of. And he's at his lowest point. He is on the cross. He is that suffering Savior. And then you get into Psalm 23, and that psalm, we'll talk about it in just a second for just a minute, where Jesus rises from being called the Lamb of God, as John calls him whenever he come to be baptized, to the shepherd. Jesus himself saying, I am the good shepherd in John chapter 10. And he is today still our living shepherd. And so that famous psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, I shall not have any need. So you see this lowest point, then him rising to shepherd, and then now we're going to get into Psalm 24. And this is one of those pilgrimage psalms, and you're going to see where he rises up and ascends to his holy place. He is the exalted sovereign God. And so basically the whole point of the cross, the crook, and the crown is Jesus going from his lowest point in his humanity all the way up to the exalted Christ that he is now. It's an interesting procession or interesting study whenever you look at it that way, and that's what we want to finish up with today. So Psalm 22, when we looked at that, basically is, you can break it down, it's a cry for help. And then it's what Jesus sees or what he feels and is experiencing from the cross. It becomes very clear that David did not experience many of the things like having his hands and his feet pierced or even his garments being divided, but yet we see those very things being fulfilled in that psalm that we talked about last week. And there's the chiastic structure of that psalm. The main thing when we talk about chiastic structure is the axis, what it primarily points to. And in this case, it's that cry for help, a cry for deliverance, a cry to be saved. And if you want to know more about Psalm 22, I encourage you to go back and watch last week and the week before when we talked specifically about how these Psalms go together and then the commentary that goes with it. Psalm 23 we've also talked about. That should be on our YouTube channel as well, but it is a psalm that is actually an imprecatory psalm. It's really three different types of psalms, and then we've talked about that too, the fact that even though we classify these psalms into their different types, they are all mixtures of different psalms, and I'll show you in just a moment. It's interesting that we use Psalm 23 a lot of times for funerals. I use it all the time. Just recently used it at a funeral. But yet the psalm is not about death. There's something about that psalm that's comforting for people who are grieving, but it's not about death at all. And it's also one of those psalms that people will cite. I do this also. Sometimes whenever I'm feeling a little bit of anxiety or whatever, I'll just stop and I will recite the 23rd Psalm, and it just has a calming effect. Yet the psalm is not about tranquility either. It's an imprecatory psalm where he's asking God to protect him, and you have all kinds of things in there. I'll show you some highlights in just a moment. It's believed to be written by David. We don't understand if it was when he was young, if he was old, or what it was. It does have a personal application, but also a congregational application. And interestingly enough, Psalm 23 is not cited anywhere in the New Testament. You would think of all the Psalms, they would be cited somewhere, but it's not. So when I say that it's multiple types of Psalms, it is one, it's a psalm of lament. And you see that because of the things that are said in it. Whenever he says things like, he restores my soul, or I'm walking through that valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He's asking God to comfort him and wanting that goodness and mercy. So it's, in a sense, he's lamenting, crying out to God to help him. In another sense, Psalm 23 is that imprecatory psalm where he's asking God to have vengeance upon those who are his enemies, like, again, restoring my soul. And he says, I will fear no evil. Well, what's that? That's like saying the model prayer, the Lord, protect us from the evil one, right? That's exactly what he's doing here. And so I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And then he's saying that he prepares that table in the presence of his enemies, and goodness and mercy will follow. So all of these have that imprecatory sense to it, that he's asking God to help him with his enemies. And then also the psalm has that messianic undertone. Whenever it talks about the Lord, that capital L-O-R-D is Yahweh. He's talking about God, and that he is the shepherd. Jesus himself said, I am the good shepherd. What does Jesus do for us? He restores our soul. He leads us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And then to dwell in the house of the Lord forever carries those undertones of being in heaven. And so you have, in this case, Psalm 23 covers 3 different types of psalms. And again, we talked about this in depth one of the evenings that we had here Sunday, and it should be on our YouTube channel if you want to know more about Psalm 23. Fascinating, fascinating psalm. But today we're looking primarily at Psalm 24. So the third of the cross, the crook, and the crown. And this psalm is one of those ascent psalms. This is a psalm that is usually sung or stated or cited in a specific time. There's all kinds of events, and we'll talk about this more in just a moment concerning this psalm, but there's all kinds of events that these psalms of ascent are used for. Whenever they are making their pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, whenever they're entering into the temple, or some other special occasion, then these psalms, these ascent psalms, are sung or they are cited because they are used in tradition a lot of times when it comes into the worship that takes place at the temple. So in this case, Psalm 24 is celebrating the arrival of the king to Jerusalem. And it seems logical to conclude, as it says there, the psalm marks the entrance of the king of Jerusalem, escorted by the Ark of the Covenant. Go to 2 Samuel 6 with me real quick. 2 Samuel chapter 6 is what is believed to be associated with this psalm. This seems to be, a lot of scholars look at this and say, well, here's what was happening, and so this seems to be the setting that David wrote this psalm. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, you read beginning in verse 12, it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. And then you read about that all the way through where he is dancing and everything, and bringing the ark of the Lord into what would now be known as Jerusalem. At that time it was called the city of David. And verse 17, so they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. I find that fascinating, because did the ark already have its own tabernacle? I'm pretty sure it did. One that God ordained in Exodus, right? The one that God said, build it this particular way. So where's that tabernacle? Well, if you do your study, you begin to realize the tabernacle moved out of Shiloh and to Gibeah, or Gibeon, I should say, and from there we don't know what happened to it. We also don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, other than carried away most likely whenever the Babylonians came. And so despite Indiana Jones' best effort, no one's ever going to find the Ark of the Covenant. If God wanted us to find it, it would be found. So that's what we think that is happening with Psalm 24. So let's go back now and look at the psalm. Let's read it. And then we'll break it down into its chiastic structure, which helps us see some things in it. And then we'll have some commentary on it. Psalm 24, a psalm of David. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those that dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. Who may ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, he who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. He shall receive blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him. Lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, you everlasting doors. And the King of glory shall come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. Selah. All right. So, again, the background of this is believed to be based off of 2 Samuel 6 whenever David brought this up. But there's a whole lot more going on right here, as you can see, is that the inspired pen of David, somehow we don't know how inspiration works exactly, but it moved David to be able to write these things that go beyond him. And so the psalmist, while he's writing maybe about an experience that he had, he's looking really beyond that to what Jesus would do and the impact it would have upon God's kingdom. And so if we look at the chiastic structure of this, and again, chiastic meaning that X is the word chi, or the letter chi, I should say, and the Greek alphabet is the letter X, which basically shows you have a starting point and then a parallel point, and you start to work your way in to the center. And it's that center that really is the emphasis of the psalm. And so in this case, verses 1 and 2 are your opening or your first line. The earth is the Lord's. It is he who founded it and established it. The parallel to that, all the way at the end of the psalm, is verses 7 through 10, that little section that says, lift up your heads, O gates, the King of glory may come in, the Lord of hosts. So you see the parallels there? And then you come into the next one, the next set of parallel lines, and that is verses 3 and verses 6. So who may ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? Well, the parallel to that is a contrast or is an answer to the question. And he says, this is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him, speaking of the Lord, who seek your face. And so it's the answer to the question. Then the next set of parallel lines that comes in is verses 4, the first part of 4, and verses 5. And it's answering that question again. So who can stand before the Lord? Who can enter in? Well, he who has clean hands and a pure heart. The parallel to that is, and he shall receive blessing and righteousness from the Lord, the God of his salvation. And that brings you into the axis, the main point of, or the emphasis point, not the main point, but the emphasis point, which is verse 4, the second part, and that is, he who has not lifted up soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. All right? So this is the chiastic structure, the way the Hebrew poetry works, with these parallel lines that are working in so that you see this real emphasis that he wants you to see. And in this case, it really, really answers the question of who is able to enter in. So we'll take a look at that. But first, let's look at a couple of the parallels that I'm talking about here. So if we look at line 1 and the last line, all right, it's pretty simple to see the parallelism. You see the Lord, capital L-O-R-D. Usually when you see the word with all capital letters, L-O-R-D, what does that usually signify? Yahweh. All right, it's God's name, God, Yahweh. So the earth is Yahweh's. Now at the bottom of this parallelism, you have Yahweh of hosts. All right, He is the King of glory. Come in, Yahweh of hosts. So the entire earth, everything about it is His. And then He repeats that by saying He is the King of all. It's just another way of saying the same thing. You come in and then you have the questions of who? Who can ascend? Who may stand? Well, then you have the answer, as I mentioned, you can see I've got it highlighted there, Jacob. Now, whenever he says Jacob, what's he mean? Does he mean just Jacob? Only Jacob? Just Jacob was the only one who's allowed to enter. What's he saying there? What's that? Israel. Didn't Jacob's name get changed to Israel? So what he's saying there is that there's an entire nation. There's an entire race of people that are capable of ascending. And it's that generation who seeks Him. So it answers the question of who. All right. Another thing we see in that talks about His holy place. Going back to this idea of the tabernacle. All right. Can somebody describe to me how the tabernacle was laid out? What's some features of the tabernacle?
2 rooms, one big one up front, but the smaller room in the back had the Ark of the Covenant. And there's a big curtain in between that separated them.
That's exactly right.
You go in the Holy of Holies, that smaller room.
That's exactly right. So the overall complex, you have this atrium. There's this basically a cloth wall with these posts that go around the entire facility. And you go in there, and the first thing you come to is going to be the altar. And then past the altar is the grand laver, or the basin where you would wash, where there's water. And then you come to the actual tent. And just exactly as Paul said, in that tent there's 2 rooms. And those rooms are divided by a veil or a curtain. What's the first room called?
Holy place.
The holy place. What's the second room called? The Holy of Holies. All right, so that's the place where Moses would go to meet with God. God would sit upon the mercy seat above the Ark of the Covenant. So what was Moses doing, or the high priest, when they would go into that Holy of Holies? They were right in front of His face. Right? Now, no one has seen God, but you understand the metaphor that's there. And so His holy place, and then to seek His face. A Hebrew would put those together as parallelism. So these are some of the things that you look for whenever you're trying to break down the poetry of these Hebrew psalms. And then he has some other parallelisms. All right, continuing to answer the question, He who has clean hands and a pure heart. Now, this is a beautiful reference. You see this over and over and over throughout Scripture. Whenever God said, Moses, this is how I want you to consecrate the priest. If you'll go back and read that in Exodus, He has him do something very specific. He has him take some blood and put it on 2 places. Actually 3 places, but there's 2 specific places we want to emphasize here. He's supposed to take that blood and put it up on his ear, on his hand, and on his feet. When you go to the book of Exodus, all right, where is the mark of the beast? Does anybody know where the mark of the beast is on a person? The forehead and the hand. What people don't realize is also in the book of Revelation, it talks about the fact of the seal of the Spirit. Where's that at? On the forehead and the hand. So what's he saying here? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. We're talking about the fact it's symbolism, all right? And whenever you talk about your hands, what is that? Actions. What you do, all right? And if it's on your forehead, or in this case your heart, what is that? Your mind, your thoughts. And so he's saying, who can enter into the kingdom? Who can enter into the holy place? It's the one who has the right mindset and the right actions. What did Jesus say? He said, you know a tree by its fruit, right? So you can look at it and see it, but you see its actions. James chapter 1, verse 22, be ye doers of the word, not hearers only. So you want to hear it, you want to know it, but that's not all. You got to do it also. You look at the parallelism of that in verse 5, and he says, he who shall receive blessing, righteousness, and salvation. Those are the two things that come from having clean hands and a pure heart. Also see there a parallelism into what Jesus said in the Beatitudes. Who are the ones, think about this, what does the Beatitudes say? What is the benefit or the blessing, the beatitude that those who have a pure heart, what do they receive? See God. And what do we have right here? Seek your face. Just a lot of beautiful little what I call golden nuggets in there in the Scriptures. And then, of course, you come to that main point. He who has not lifted up his soul to an idol nor sworn deceitfully. We'll cover that more in just a second as we go through the commentary. Does this make sense to everybody now, looking at the chiastic structure? All right. I think, yeah, we're going to stay right there then. We're going to use that chiastic structure. So I want you to, number one, understand that I don't have every single word up there of the psalm. As you can see, verses 7 through 10, it's kind of it's a abbreviated version of everything that's said here, okay? So just so that you can understand how the psalm is put together with those colors and with the chiastic structure and everything. So now, let's look at what's going on here. All right, the psalm begins by beautifully proclaiming the complete sovereignty of God. Can anybody tell me what the word sovereign means? Because that's such an important word when it comes to God. What does sovereign mean? It's okay if you don't know, but if you do know, let me know. Anybody? It means all authority. Is that what you're going to say? Absolute, total, absolute, all authority. Isn't that a beautiful, perfect word for God? Sovereign. And so it's talking about the sovereignty of God. Well, how do you know that He has absolute all authority? The earth is His. It is He who founded it. So read it. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Does He say some part of its fullness? It says all of its fullness. The world and those who dwell in. For He has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. So whenever David is writing this, he is hearkening back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. What do we have in Genesis chapter 1 and 2? Creation. The creation account. How did God create the world? He spoke it into existence. Is that not extreme or supreme power? And so when you say God is sovereign, that is exactly what it is. So he's starting out by establishing a very important point before he gets to his question. All right, so he's saying that the main point of this psalm is who, right? Who may ascend to the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in His holy place? But before he gives that, he establishes something very, very important. God is sovereign. God is almighty. God is the one who created everything. Now, who's writing the psalm? It's not a trick question. David. David wrote the psalm. Had David accomplished things in his life? So what are some of the things that David accomplished in his life? Y'all know these stories. There you go. He killed Goliath. Killed wild animals as a kid. What else? They used to sing songs about David. Made Saul mad. What was the song that they would sing about David? There it is. He killed his tens of thousands, right? Oh, Saul didn't like that. And then, who is David? He is King David, right? He's the anointed of God. And he has this entire kingdom. But you know what's interesting? Israel is a little bitty tiny kingdom in comparison to the kingdoms around him. And that's a beautiful picture of what he's saying right here. Who is David in comparison to Yahweh? Yahweh, who the earth belongs to and all that is in it, because he founded it. So what does that do to the writer? It puts him in his place, doesn't it? It gets rid of that ugly word that starts with the letter P. What's that word? Pride. It gets rid of that pride. All right, so before you even ask the question, you need to understand where you stand in the pecking order of all things, of all creation. You are nothing. So therefore, who may ascend into the hill? Who may stand in his holy place? All right. This isn't about mountain climbing. This isn't about your hill climbing assembly or anything, ability, I should say. But it is the what? What's he basically asking here? What's another way of saying, who may ascend to the hill of the Lord, who may stand in his holy place? Seek. Who may come into God's presence, right? Who may consider themselves to belong to him, right? So, if, going back to the first statement that he made about who God is sovereign, and now he's asking this question of who, well then, who gets to put forth the standards of how one approaches him? Exactly. That's the point that he's trying to make. He's like, look, who may stand? You need to understand that whatever it is, if you want to come before God, you're going to do it on his terms, not your terms. Don't we have a problem with that in religion today? Yes, absolutely. People want to do it on their terms. And that's such a strong lesson for us today that people lose because they want to come up with their own ways. And so this is a question that is still relevant. Here, a psalm written, almost 3,000 years ago is still relevant to us today. Because, as we see, we go through here, only those who have these things. And who gave these things? What are these requirements? Where do they come from? They came from God. All right, so now you get into this idea of he who has clean hands and a pure heart. We talked about just a minute ago how the Bible uses that, the idea of the hand and the heart. The heart is considered the totality of man. We don't actually think with our hearts, do we? We use our brain. You see those stickers that says, I heart New York? Have y'all ever seen a sticker that says, I brain New York? Because we don't think of it that way. We think of it, where do we feel? We feel it right here. That's why the heart is considered the totality of man. So your actions and your thoughts, in other words, we're talking about your moral character. Now, entering into the holy place, all right, going back to this idea of the tabernacle, what did the priest have to do? Could they just walk in there nilly-villy, and however they wanted to?
They had to ritually wash first.
Exactly. Even though they may be perfectly clean coming from their tent, right, coming to do their service, right, before they go in, they had to wash. Is there symbolism there? Absolutely. Absolutely. You had to be clean going in. And so, one has to have clean hands and a pure heart. We already talked about the fact of what the Beatitudes say about seeing God's face. But what is a pure heart? What is that? How does one get a pure heart? Pray for it, exactly. In fact, David is a great example of this in Psalm, is it 51 or 54? I think it's 51, where he says, create in me a clean heart. All right, purge me with hyssop. Just trying to find some way to do it. How are our hearts cleaned? How are our hearts purified? How are our hearts actually purified and cleansed in order to be able to stand in front of God? There it is, baptism. And what is that baptism? In blood, right? Now, isn't that interesting? I don't know how many of you do your own laundry or anything. I do mine, and Andrea does hers. That's just the way our household is. I've never used blood to cleanse my shirts or anything. Just doesn't work very well, does it, Tara? It doesn't work very well, right? But isn't that interesting that blood cleanses us, gives us that pure heart. And then this is where we get in now to the axis. So think about that. You get clean hands. All right, so you have the action of going down into water. Just like those priests had to wash with water to go in. That was all symbolism. Well, it's symbolism also to go down into this water because it represents many different things. One, it represents being buried, immersed, put below something like Jesus was put below the earth in his death. But it's also in that action of being like dipping down into the blood. All right? And then when you come up, I mean, you still look the same. It's not for, as Peter says, the cleansing of the flesh. What's it for? It's for, say again, Josh? The answer of a good conscience. So there's something taking place inside. It's in the spiritual realm that God has cleansed you there. You have now come up, as he says, white as snow. Now that you have that, look in verse 4. This is that axis, the main part here. It is the soul, all right, that is not lifted up to an idol. What are we talking about here? We're talking about spiritual things. When you talk about the soul, you're talking about that part that's going to return to God, the soul. And it is not lifted up to idols, nor sworn deceitfully. Isn't that interesting? If you want to come to God, if you want to be His child, you have to do a couple of things. You have to go through this process before you get to the baptism, right? What is the five? We like to use a 5-finger process or 5-point process. What's the first one? You got to hear the gospel, believe, confess, and be baptized. So look at that. Not lifting up a soul, all right? So in other words, there's that belief. Because why would you go to an idol unless you believe in that idol, right? So you're saying, I don't believe in that. I believe in God. And then the not sworn, in other words, saying out loud deceitfully. You're speaking the truth, as in Jesus said, Matthew 10, verse 32, you confess me before men, I'll confess you before my Father in heaven. Have you ever thought about the fact that Abraham, for example, whenever he took Isaac, when God commanded him to take Isaac up onto the Mount Moriah and to sacrifice him, what was that action right there? That was a confession, right? It was Abraham confessing to God, I believe in you. I'm going to do what you tell me to do. So through not only his words, but his actions, even God said, now I know. Did God already know what was going to happen and everything else? But what does he want us to do? He wants us to manifest it. He wants us to say it, to do it. Show me. It's like your children. You know that your children love you. But doesn't it speak volumes whenever they tell you and they show it? That's the same thing with God. God wants to see it. Yes?
This is somewhat related, but I've often wondered about Naaman.
Yeah.
When Naaman had to dip 7 times in the river, how much belief did he actually have? Because he was pagan.
Oh, yeah.
He'd been told about the prophet. He'd been told about God. But he still had to dip 7 times. He still had to do something that was a little demeaning. So he had to decide to actually follow through to, not just 1 time, not just 2 times getting wet, all 7 times. At what point did he actually have a genuine belief that this Israelite God was going to do something for him? Was it somewhere between 1 and 7? Was it not until he came up from the water the 7th time and he could physically see it? Which, the Bible talks about people who believe without having physically been there to meet Jesus, as opposed to the disciples were in his presence. We never met Jesus, but we believed him in anyway.
Yeah.
But did Naaman believe prior to coming up the 7th time? I don't know. But he was still healed. It was still, he had to accept what he was told to do and follow through on it.
Exactly.
Before he received anything.
Well, I believe it's the same thing. Number one, he had to submit.
Yeah.
And that's the first thing we have to do. If you want to be saved, you have to submit.
Proud, prominent man.
Yeah, you have to submit to God and submit to God's way, and he did. Whenever somebody is baptized, and this isn't the case for everybody, but when somebody's baptized, do they know everything there is to know about the Christian faith? There you go. So chances are, he learned more later, and that's the way we are too. It's a lifelong process. So what is the result of this? You know, he who has clean hands and pure heart has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. Do we have a perfect example that we can follow of somebody that was like that? Jesus. Jesus. Did he have clean hands, a pure heart, not lift up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully? Exactly. We can follow that. And if that's the case, what is the result? What is the result of doing all those things and having those things? Verse 5. He shall receive blessing. What's the blessing that we receive? Salvation, number one. What else does Jesus tell us that we will have? John 10, verse 10. Peace and an abundant life, right? Love, joy, peace, faithfulness, patience, faithfulness, goodness, kindness, all those things, the fruit of the Spirit. And so, therefore, you see here, he says, righteousness from the Lord. Do anybody know what righteousness is? What's righteousness? I love that. That's my favorite definition, being right with God. Righteousness is being right with God. You could also say it is having that perfect justice. It's the quality of being morally right, having the right behavior, the right attributes. But I like that one the best, being right with God. So you're righteous. You're right with God. So you get righteousness from the Lord. You're justified. You're approved by God. And therefore, the God of His salvation. Now, this is long before Jesus comes, but yet look what the penman, the psalmist, is writing about. Salvation. Tying that back to the soul, right? Isn't it interesting that long before Jesus came, and then it was clearly laid out through the apostles like Paul and others exactly what salvation is and how that works. Here the psalmist is writing it almost 1,000 years before Jesus. Goes on to say, as we said, this is Jacob, the generation of those who seek him and seek his face. He's specifically talking in his time about the nation of Israel, because that's at the time was God's people. But now that Jesus has come, is there a nation of those who seek him? Is there still a Jacob out there? What is it, Jack?
Christians, the church is the new Israel.
Christians, the church is the new Israel. We are the spiritual Israel. So what is, I never can remember exactly. It's either 2 Peter 1:8 or 2:8 or 1 Peter 2:8, where it says, we are, somebody look that up for me and read that. Talking about a holy nation. Anybody got that?
It's
1 Peter 2:8 or 2:9. I got so much in my head.
You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. You may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
That's 1 Peter 2:9. Thank you. 1 Peter 2:9. You are a holy nation, his generation, his special people. So this still applies to us, those who seek his face. And then, you remember we talked about the word Selah. Does anybody remember what Selah is, or what it's for, what it represents? It's like a pause, and it's a time to take in what you just said and understood and look up to heaven and give that to God. So you pause. All right, so this beautiful, beautiful thing that he said. Then he goes up into that, lift up your heads, O you gates, and lift up your everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, lift up your everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? Now, I told you that this is an ascension psalm. This is one of those psalms that they sing or that they recite during certain specific times. Well, this is believed, according to rabbinic writings, was recited on the first day of the week in the temple. Now, what is the first day of the week? Sunday, all right? So not Sabbath. Sabbath is Saturday. That's the last day of the week, the seventh day, whenever they worshiped. On the first day of the week, they would cite this psalm in the temple. And if that's the case, think about this. That means somewhere in the temple, there was a priest standing there reading this psalm out as Jesus was ascending up to Jerusalem on, what do they call that? Palm Sunday. The triumphal entry on that donkey when he's coming in. Can you get the picture there? Wouldn't that be something? It's like a movie for me right there. I can just see this priest reciting this psalm, and then meanwhile out here outside the city, here comes Jesus up on a donkey, ascending to the temple. Beautiful, beautiful picture there. So, I hope you now have a better understanding of the cross, the crook, and the crown, and especially today with Psalm 24, this ascension psalm that gives glory to God, and it is a messianic psalm about Jesus ascending up to his rightful place as the King of all, and the Lord of lords, and the host of all. All right? Thank you so much for listening. We're going to prepare now for our worship.